Okay, it's just about 2 minutes after 12, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa DeMars, and I am the Upper Peninsula Behavioral Health Consultant for the Michigan Opioid Collaborative. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. This is our webinar on a modern understanding of the addicted brain, presented by our staff physician, Dr. Jonathan Morrow. Before we get started, a couple things to go over real quick. You'll see on the screen here, we do have CME information if you're trying to obtain CME credits for today. You can feel free to follow the instructions here or use the QR code. We'll also be posting in the chat how to obtain CEU credits and McBAP credits. So keep your eyes posted on the chat for those instructions. A couple of other housekeeping issues. Please make sure you are muted if you are not presenting or sharing. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them into the chat, and we'll get to those either during the transition of slides or during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. If you haven't already done so, please sign into the chat with your name, email address, and organization you're with for attendance purposes, and so we can send you the presentation slides. As mentioned, a PDF with instructions for obtaining McBAP and CEU credits for today's webinar will be posted here in the chat after we begin. The links to obtain credits will expire within 48 hours, so please make sure you complete this process by Wednesday, April 19th at 12 p.m. You will also receive a follow-up email after today's webinar with instructions for obtaining credits that are available, and your regional BHC will also follow up with you and provide the slides used for today's presentation. I'm going to do a quick overview of the Michigan Opioid Collaborative Project, or MOC. We're a grant-funded program aimed at increasing the availability of medications for opioid use disorder treatment in Michigan, as well as bringing awareness and education around all other substance use disorders. The MOC offers free same-day patient consultation services to providers treating patients with substance use disorder. MOC offers quarterly introduction to buprenorphine trainings, as well as webinars on a variety of topics around addiction, healthcare, and substance use. We provide support for diagnosis, treatment planning, and medication management for patients with substance use disorders, including pregnant and perinatal patients. We have a hepatologist on our team who offers hepatitis C treatment consultation within 48 hours, facilitates a biweekly case consultation webinar to review cases with providers, and has developed a 3-part webinar series on hepatitis C treatment. We've also created toolkits for providers to have additional resources when treating patients with different substance use disorders. Your local BHC will follow up with you after the webinar today. Please connect with them for more information and to get connected to resources through the MOC. You may also email the MOC at the email that's listed at the bottom of this slide. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and introduce to you today our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Jonathan Morrow. He received his MD and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Michigan, where he is now an associate professor of psychiatry. His laboratory research focuses on the neurobiology of motivated behavior, and since 2011, he has provided medication management and other clinical care to patients through the University of Michigan Addiction Treatment Services, or UMATS. So thank you, Dr. Morrow, for being here and presenting, and go ahead and I'll turn it over to you. You can share your screen.
Okay, great, thanks. And thanks to everyone who is joining in. Thanks for your interest in this topic. So I will be discussing the neurobiology of addiction. And one way to frame this is an attempt to answer this basic question: why do people use drugs? And if you're trying to understand the answer to this, the most straightforward way of answering that is just to ask people, why are you using drugs? And if you do that, you'll get a variety of answers. People certainly do have an answer to that. One of the most common is that it's fun. You get some pleasure out of it, and it's just an enjoyable thing to do. Other times people will maybe they're trying to relieve stress or tension by using drugs. Related, maybe they have depression or some other kind of psychiatric illness that they're trying to treat, basically, with these drugs. Maybe they're just curious. They've heard about it. They want to see what it's like. Maybe they want to unlock new aspects of their thinking in their mind. There's a sense of adventure or trying to learn more about themselves. So there's a variety of answers you can get to that question. And what all of these have in common is that the drug use is a means to an end. It's a tool to reach some kind of goal, some kind of conscious goal that you have. So you're using drugs in order to meet this kind of conscious goal that you have. And for the longest time, this was our understanding of what drug use is. And in fact, probably today, most people think about drug use in this way. But this view started to be challenged a bit by neurobiological research, starting around the 1950s, with a simple observation that animals use drugs. And a whole variety of animals will use drugs: rats, cats, monkeys. They use the same drugs that humans do. Sometimes they don't have opposable thumbs, so you may have to help them out a little bit in order for them to use it. But if they have the opportunity to use drugs, they love it. They very enthusiastically will use drugs. And you see behaviors that look a lot like human addiction in these animals. And so that raises that calls into question some of the reasons that people give for using drugs. Are these animals, we're less likely to attribute a conscious goal to an animal when they're engaging in a behavior like that. And it at least raises the possibility that some non-conscious processes may be involved. Maybe the reasons that people are giving for using drugs aren't the whole story. Maybe there's some other processes that below consciousness that's going on in addiction. And when I'm talking neurobiologically, that means non-cortical areas may be important for the addiction process. So what do I mean by non-cortical? So these are two brains. On the left is a human brain, kind of a cartoon of a brain. On the right is the brain of in this case, it's a rat brain. And in green, these areas are the cortex, the cortical areas. These are the cortex is what's responsible for thinking and conscious planning. This is the you part of your brain, as opposed to the deeper, like the red areas and the blue areas. These are subcortical areas that are more involved in non-conscious things, emotional states, sometimes in the case of the brainstem, like just bodily functions that are not really conscious processes that the brain controls. So you see, in humans, our brain is dominated by these cortical areas. So if you're looking for an explanation for why somebody is engaging in a behavior, you just throw a dart at the picture here. If it's a human brain, you're probably going to hit something green. And so most likely there's a cortical reason. There's some conscious reason that they're doing this. In the case of an animal, they have a cortex. It's there, but it's not dominating the brain in the same way. And so it's more likely, if an animal is really robustly engaging in this, it's more likely a subconscious process is happening, something in these red or blue areas that's contributing to addiction. And we know that these two sort of broad parts of the brain, the conscious and the non-conscious, are in tension with each other all the time. And the question with addiction is, which one is in control of the addictive process? And as we'll see, the process of addiction it's really a movement away from cortical control and more towards this subcortical non-conscious control over the drug use. But this tension between conscious and subconscious, cortical and subcortical. That's been known for a very long time. In the ancient world, the ancient Greeks had this analogy of a chariot, where the question is, who's in control of this chariot? We can think of these horses as the kind of more ancient subconscious, subcortical parts of the brain that are giving you urges, what we might call animalistic urges, whereas the charioteer is the cortex. That's you making your conscious decisions. And if you think of a chariot, if it's a well-trained horses, well-trained charioteer, that's going to go where the charioteer wants it to go. That's the person in charge of where that whole unit is going. But ultimately, really, that chariot's going to go wherever the horses tell it to go. If they're not listening to the charioteer, or if he drops the reins or whatever, it's going to go where the horses go. So you could argue that the charioteer kind of has an illusion of control in some ways over that chariot. And we like to think that we're in charge, that we are in conscious control of basically everything that we do. We're making conscious choices I decided to get up in the morning and put on my clothes and go to work and do things, log in and go to this lecture. All of that was a conscious decision that I made. But the research has shown that actually making that conscious decision is a very small part of our behavior. Most of what we do is kind of automatic. It's governed by these subcortical processes. And our conscious mind just kind of peeks in every once in a while and says, oh, what are we doing? Oh, yeah, yep, that's what I meant to do. Yep, carry on. And then goes back to sleep, basically, while we automatically do what we were doing. And just to give you an example of that is breathing. So I'll just assume, I can probably safely assume that everyone on this call is breathing. But I can also pretty safely assume that you weren't thinking about that until I mentioned it. So it wasn't your conscious mind that was making that decision to breathe, yet you were still breathing. And it's your subcortical areas, mainly your brainstem, that was driving that breathing. And if I ask you why you're breathing, I'm sure you could tell me why you're breathing. You'll have some story about, I need oxygen to go into my lungs, to circulate in my blood so that I can stay alive and get to my cells. But none of that was why you were breathing before I mentioned it. That was all controlled by your brainstem. The brainstem just has a little sensor that senses carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and when they get too high, you take a breath. It doesn't know anything about oxygen. It doesn't know anything about lungs. It doesn't know anything about being alive. None of that goes into the decision-making process. That's what's driving the breathing. But I can say that I am in control of my breathing, and it's true. I am in control of my breathing. I can breathe in, I can breathe out, I can decide not to breathe. Doing it right now. But if I decide not to breathe for 5 minutes, then my brainstem is going to produce a very strong, increasingly irresistible urge to breathe. And I may come up with a story of why I decided to take a breath. I don't want to die or whatever it is. But the fact is, I'm going to take a breath because my brainstem is telling me to take a breath, regardless of what my cortex, my cortical mind, may be telling me to do. And that's a tension that's there all the time. In the process of addiction, there's a loss of control. What started out as something that you're doing on purpose to meet some goal gets hijacked by these subcortical areas, and now it's just an urge that you kind of have to do, regardless of what your goals were. And you may tell yourself that you're still in charge, that oh, I wanted to do that because X, Y, Z. You may actually believe that. We really have a strong desire to believe that we're making conscious choices all the time, but that doesn't necessarily match up with reality. And one of the challenges in treating addiction is getting that message across to someone that you're not actually in charge of this anymore. because it's not a welcome message. You can think of people like this that I see, you know, they're coming, this person is driving a car and they're very happy about it, very self-confident. And the last thing he wants to hear is me coming in and say, you know, that steering wheel actually isn't controlling anything. You know, he's like, get out of here. I'm driving here. I'm turning the wheel. It goes this way. I said, well, you know, the drive shaft is way over here. It's not connected to this. It's not going to do anything. Yeah, that's not he'll say, get out of here. You're going to make me crash. It distracted me. I'm trying to drive. It's not a welcome message. But in order to make a change, the person really needs to understand that they have lost control. Something else is driving that car at this point, not their conscious self anyway. So talk a little bit more about why this happened. And by the way, if there's questions as we go, just go ahead and ask. I can entertain those as we go. So what's actually driving this, we know is, you know, a big part of it anyway is in the nucleus accumbens. And this is the basic biology of addiction. This is actually the best understood neurobiologically of all the psychiatric disorders. There's a lot we don't know about addiction, but there's a lot that we actually do. And one is that first of all, you need drugs in order to have an addiction. That's part of why we could research this and be so confident about it. And all drugs of abuse will increase dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, this subcortical structure. And that's really the only thing they have in common. We know of millions of biological compounds. There's maybe a couple dozen of them that are addictive. They have nothing in common with each other. Cannabinoids are these big hydrophobic molecules. You have stimulants, which tend to be smaller, polar molecules. You got alcohol, which is about as simple as you can get. They all act on different receptors. But, for example, stimulants will block reuptake of dopamine in the synapse. So that pretty directly just increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Opioids will inhibit GABAergic interneurons, which are inhibitory. So it disinhibits dopaminergic neurons within the ventral tegmental area, which then increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So less direct, but it's still the same result. It increases dopamine in the accumbens. There are other things that increase dopamine, natural reinforcers, food, sex, anything that you find that is pleasurable or meets some goal. It could be a really good lecture that you're in. Anything that you're getting some satisfaction out of is going to increase dopamine. And that's good. You can see kind of evolutionary why that would be useful. Is, you know, it's a way to get you to do things that you should do that are meeting your goals. And normally the way this works is you do something that causes pleasure, that causes satisfaction, meets some goal, and that pleasure, that satisfaction causes a dopamine release. And the dopamine then causes a desire to repeat that activity. Whatever you just did, you want to do it again because of this dopamine release. In the case of addiction, what goes wrong is that drugs directly release dopamine. It's not tied to the consequence of the use. Whether it was pleasurable, whether it met your goals or not, it will release dopamine and it will produce a desire to do it again. It could have been the worst experience of your life, but it released dopamine directly, so it will cause a desire to do it again. And I'll talk about this in a little more detail, kind of what the nucleus accumbens does in this circuit. So what the accumbens does is part of a larger circuit, kind of an emotional learning circuit. And it essentially ties our perceptions and our emotions to behaviors. That's the purpose of this circuit. And I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but just to give you a sense. So things are, events are processed on several levels as they happen, and you have experiences. And so that's represented here. So the top level here is this detection or stimulus detection. This would be like if you encounter a bottle of beer, you just see a bottle of beer. So your sensory cortex, your thalamus, that's going to recognize that as a beer bottle. So, oh, that's a beer bottle. Okay, so that's one level of processing. Then it gets passed on to the next level, which is hippocampus, amygdala. That will attach emotions, memories, associations to that stimulus. So it would be like, oh, the last time I saw a beer bottle, I was at a party, I was with my friends, I was having a good time. So those get attached to the stimulus. And then the next level is where the nucleus accumbens comes in. That's where you're making decisions. There's also cortex involved here, but you're making a decision at that point. Am I going to drink this beer? Am I going to walk away from this? What's my response going to be to that? And then whatever you choose, that gets passed on to the next one, to the motor cortex, brainstem, that will prepare your body to do whatever it is you decided to do. Now, dopamine in this system, particularly in the nucleus accumbens, is going to make all of those decisions, all of those connections, more likely to happen the next time you encounter that stimulus. So in the case of the beer bottle, if you decide to drink that beer, you get a dopamine release, and that will strengthen all of these connections so that the next time you see a beer bottle, you'll make the same associations with the same memories, the same emotions. You'll make the same decision to drink, and you'll get the same result of dopamine, and so you'll repeat that behavior again. And again, this is regardless of the consequences. So you can, it reminds me of a song. There's a Katy Perry song called Last Friday Night. It's very catchy, upbeat tune. If you listen to the lyrics, it's about a night of drinking. And what she describes, there's a lot of like bad things that happen in this night of drinking. She's injured. She loses her car. She thinks she's going to get fired. She's facing criminal charges. She thinks she was sexually assaulted. And the refrain is, next Friday night, do it all again. Like it's a habit. Why would you want to do that again? Well, the reason is because you got a dopamine release, because you drank alcohol, it caused a dopamine release. And so you're going to repeat whatever experience you just had. And you're going to come up with some story about why that was fun and why you wanted to do it again. Think about if that happened sober. You would not want to repeat that night. But this is why addiction is pathological. It bypasses all of that goal setting, and regardless of what happens, makes you want to do it again. Okay, so another aspect of this is that the dopamine release gets sensitized over time. So most effects of drugs you get tolerant to, meaning the effects diminish over time. That's not true with the dopamine release. So this is a direct measurement of dopamine from an animal who's received drugs. This is in the nucleus accumbens. And so we've got two groups of animals here. In white here, you see this animal got a dose of amphetamine, and the dopamine goes up pretty dramatically, reliably. You get a dopamine burst after the amphetamine. In black is a group of animals that are also getting amphetamine, but instead of their first time of amphetamine, like the ones in white, this is their sixth time getting amphetamine. And you see the dopamine release is stronger. And if it was the seventh time, it would be even stronger. If the 10th time, stronger than that, 20th time, stronger than that. It sensitizes, it increases over time. And this is a kind of a biological readout of the motivation to use, the craving, essentially. That increases the more you use, as opposed to the pleasure that you're getting. That's not dopamine. People talk about dopamine as a pleasure molecule. It's very annoying to neuroscientists because we've known for like 40 years that it's not a pleasure. It's not a pleasure molecule. It's more like a motivational molecule. So if anything, within this circuit. So the desire to use is getting stronger. The pleasure that you get from using it, the satisfaction, that's probably mediated by opioids, but that you get tolerant to, so that goes away. So this is why in later stages of addiction, I'll have people say things like, you know, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't understand why I do this anymore. It's not even fun. I don't even enjoy it anymore. Well, this is why. It's because you have this increased desire to use that's totally divorced from the pleasure that you're not getting pleasure anymore from the drug. It's just a direct desire from this dopamine release. And it's all unconscious, subconscious. People make up stories about why they're doing it, but in the brain, this is why it's happening. Okay, so another aspect of this to understand is that this is a learning process, and the timing of the dopamine release matters a lot for the addictive process. So this can be illustrated by different routes of administration. Will get the dopamine release faster or slower, you know, after the substance use. So you can make this type of graph for any drug. We'll say cocaine in this just as an example. If you ingest cocaine, like the traditional way, if you take coca leaves, you chew them up, you ingest that, you'll get high, you'll get a dopamine release after about an hour or so after you've used that. Snorting cocaine is much faster. That'll happen. Dopamine will get to the brain in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. Injection is even faster. If you shoot up cocaine directly into the vein, that's right in your bloodstream, goes to the heart, up to the lungs, back through the heart to the brain again. That takes about 30 seconds or so before you get that dopamine release. And the fastest way is with smoking. So that would be like crack cocaine. You just getting that right into the lungs, goes to the heart and right up to the brain. That takes 2 or 3 seconds before you get a dopamine release. Now, remember that the dopamine is going to make you want to do that again. It doesn't know, it's a subconscious process. It doesn't know that cocaine is what caused the dopamine release. All it's doing is whatever you just did, do that again. And so in the case of ingesting, if it took an hour before the dopamine release, you did a lot of other stuff in between there. And so the association, what is strengthening, is a lot of stuff, you know, maybe it's some drug use, but a lot of other stuff. Whereas in the case of, you know, smoking crack cocaine, the crack pipe is still in your mouth. That's going to be reinforced very, very strongly. And so the addiction process happens faster and more strongly if the dopamine release is fast, if that drug is acting very quickly. Now this is important with treatment of addiction, because this is why we can use substances that will release dopamine and have addictive properties in order to treat addiction. Things like buprenorphine or nicotine patches, they have a longer time period, or a longer time course of that dopamine release. And so it's spread out over time, so that in effect weakens the connection between the drug use and the dopamine release. That makes it less addictive. And it can, like I said, weaken that association, even if it is an opioid, even if it's the same thing, nicotine, you're reinforcing things other than drug use because a lot of other stuff is happening when that dopamine release is going on. Okay. So another aspect of this is that we can understand better when we know the neurobiology is the effect of stress on substance use and craving. So stress sensitizes the dopamine response. So I showed you in an earlier slide that repeated substance use sensitizes that dopamine response, increases the craving. Well, stress does a similar thing. And so here I've got a graph of, again, this is a direct measurement in an animal of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens after drug use. And so I've got two groups again. In gray, we have animals who are taking a dose of cocaine this time. And you see the increase in dopamine after cocaine use, very reliable. In blue, we've got another set of animals that are, again, getting cocaine. It's the same dose of cocaine. They're also seeing cocaine for the first time. But the difference is that these blue animals have been stressed. And it's not like a traumatic stress. It's just we repeatedly kind of mess with them. Like we dump some cold water on them or tilt their cage a little bit or sleep deprive them or just annoying things that have probably happened to you, something similar, but just stressing them out. And you see in those circumstances, the dopamine release is faster, it lasts longer, it's a sensitized dopamine release. So the desire to use is stronger when under stress. This is why stress is a major trigger for relapse. There's three main triggers for relapse. One is cues that are associated with the drug, something that reminds you of the drug itself, and stress. And this is why, because it just makes all of those responses to drug cues stronger. This is why treating comorbid psychiatric disorders and other things is very important for recovery. All of these things stress people out. It's going to put them at greater risk for relapse if that's untreated. They need skills in order to deal with that stress. It's also why the kind of traditional approach of punishing substance use is ineffective. You can't punish addiction out of somebody. The effect, I mean, first of all, we know that's just not a very, it's not totally ineffective, but it's not a very effective way of changing any kind of behavior. But in the case of addiction, it stresses people out. There was this old show, I hope it's not on anymore, this show called Intervention, where they would have an addicted person and they were basically ambushed by a bunch of family members who sit around in a circle telling what a bad person they are and they should stop using drugs. That stresses people out. There's a lot of research that shows that does not help, and in fact, it probably makes them more likely to use. Much more effective way is rewards, rewarding sobriety, in effect, positive reinforcement. Much more effective way of treating substance use. This is the basis of contingency management. It's a positive reinforcement effect. There's a ton of research showing very good effects on addiction outcomes with that sort of approach. And again, part of that is because of this neurobiology. You want to tap into the dopamine release caused by the rewards in the service of sobriety. That's going to be more effective than just trying to work against the stress. Okay. So a little more about what dopamine does in these circuits, in these synapses. So I talked about the nucleus accumbens and kind of signals coming in associated with drugs and other things. So that comes from a lot of different areas. One of the areas that comes from is from the cortex, but there's other areas too. And what this does is when you encounter the beer bottle, say, that will activate these synapses that are carrying information about the beer bottle, about using the beer bottle, whatever it is. Those are active. And if you get substance use, you get dopamine release. In the presence of dopamine, those synapses that just were active or are still active, those get strengthened by the dopamine. That's why they're more likely to fire again. That's what's connecting the stimulus to the associations, to the decision, to the behavior. It's strengthening those synapses that are active or were just active. And so that's what strengthens the drug use behavior and whatever was associated with that dopamine. But we can use that in the other way, in the other direction, because healthy activities will also release dopamine. And that will strengthen the motivation for sobriety if you do that. Because so another thing that happens, so it strengthens these, in the case of drug use, this strengthens these drug-related associations and behaviors. At the same time, any synapse that was not active is going to get weakened by the dopamine, these surrounding synapses. So that means the desire to do other things other than substance use gets diminished. Things like your job, your kids, your family, all of the things that were important to you, those lose importance because they're all being weakened by this substance use. Again, that same thing we can use if we develop some other kind of healthy activity that also releases dopamine that's not drug related. That will strengthen the synapses associated with healthy activities. It will weaken the drug related motivation. That's why it's very important finding meaning and fulfillment in sobriety. That is a central challenge for sobriety. I get a lot of people who say, and they're being genuine. I want to stop drinking. This is all I do. I'm just gonna stop drinking. And one of the first questions I'll ask is, that's great. What are you going to do instead of drinking? Are you just going to sit in a chair and not drink? Because that's not going to work very well, right? You have to find something else that gives you fulfillment, gives you real satisfaction, and that's going to be different for everybody. That will release dopamine, and that's going to strengthen, that's going to make it more likely for you to engage in those behaviors and less likely to engage in the drug use in the future. This is what I like to say. If you want to change your life, you have to change your life. You can't just, it's not going to work to just do the same thing that I was doing before, except not using. Something else has to replace that. Something really meaningful has to replace that. So that's a way that you can actually help to reverse some of this neurobiology. So another thing is, I haven't talked much about the cortex. I've talked a lot about the accumbens, but this is another very important part of the circuitry is the prefrontal cortex and other cortical areas. The purpose of these, or the function of these areas within this circuit, a big function of it is to restrain your urges, restrain subcortical urges in situations where they're inappropriate, or sometimes to encourage them when they are appropriate. But that's your brakes, that's your control system, is your prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain now. And that is directly damaged by substance use. Pretty much all sorts of substances of abuse, alcohol certainly, in this case it's cocaine, but all of them will reduce functioning in those cortical areas. This is an illustration of this. This is a brain scan, a PET scan of someone engaging in a task that involves some control. And in a control subject, you see the front of the brain here. This is the orbital frontal cortex is very active. It's lighting up very bright. And someone who's used a lot of cocaine is just not able to do that. It doesn't function as well. This means that they are less able to control. This is neurobiological. They're less able to control those urges to use. They may want to stop, but they're just physically not able to exert the same kind of control over those subcortical processes that are already sensitized.
We have a question, Dr. Morrow.
Yeah.
Asking, can it rebuild itself?
Yes. So I'm actually leading right into it, or anticipating my next one.
Okay.
So yes, therapy can help that process along. I mean, some of it is what I mentioned, this kind of strengthening synapses through engaging in healthy activities. But one of the things that therapy can do is strengthen that cortical control, is basically exercising it. And some of the simple things that we can do are talking about the urges, just saying it out loud. What that does is you're using language. Language is a human thing. That is you have to have a cortex in order to do that. And if you are just the act of talking, using language will engage these centers, and you can give them a chance to be involved in the conversation about whether to use it or not. If you're just literally talking about it, so that's something that you can do to strengthen the influence of the cortex over the drug use behavior. Another thing is thinking about future consequences. We call this playing the tape forward. Predicting the future, thinking about the future, that's something that humans do very well. Animals, not so much. You need a lot of cortex in order to do that. The monkey brain, for sometimes people call it. And so we'll have people, if they want to use, say, okay, let's think about what's going to happen. If I really want to use alcohol, what's going to happen? I'll have a drink, I'll feel better, okay. Then what? Well, knowing me, I'll probably have another drink, and then I'm probably, then I'll get drunk, probably a little, then I'll get in trouble at home, and I'd be in trouble at work and all these things. And then as they're talking, the desire is leaving. it's diminishing because they're thinking about these consequences. And from a neurobiological perspective, they're engaging their cortex in this decision making. You have to engage your cortex in order to think about those future consequences. So if you give yourself an opportunity to do that, then you can exert some control over these subcortical urges. It's not a conscious thing that's driving this. If they're really engaging their conscious self in this decision, they're going to decide not to use. So it's giving it a chance there. And that's something you can practice and get better at over time and actually strengthen these synapses.
There's another question in regards to diminished self-control. This leads to increased impulsive non-drug using behaviors, for example, buying things, etc.
Yes, it can, because the same circuits are involved in all kinds of natural rewards. So that reduced control is going to lead to lots of, as you said, impulsive behaviors. It can lead to other kind of addictive, like not non-substance addictive behaviors, behavioral addictions, gambling, things like that. They all have a very related neural circuitry. But yeah, you can get a lot of different impulsive behaviors from the type of brain damage that you get from substance use. Yeah. And I'll mention, this is, some people are just naturally have less control than others because of their neurobiology. And so they are impulsive people. They're going to be at higher risk for developing an addiction because they have that type of personality. We also call people with that kind of neurobiology teenagers. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed to the same extent as their subcortex. This is part of why teenagers are at higher risk for substance use, because they just don't have the capacity to control these subcortical urges like that. Okay, so I think this is the last point that I'll try to convey. So another aspect to substance use is that these circuits is that they're organized in looping spirals. So the information and decision making goes through the cortex, thalamus, striatum, all these again and again as you're making a decision, just spirals through. And as it's being processed, this decision to say you encountered a beer bottle and your decision, well, are you going to drink that beer? That goes through several rounds of decision making, and it moves through different parts of the brain as it does that. It moves from the orange or the red to the orange to the yellow to the all the way to the blue. And just focusing on the cortical parts here, it starts out in, say, orbital frontal cortex, moves through to the motor cortex. The types of decisions that are being made changes a little bit as it moves through here. So at first, the decision is, am I going to drink this or not? Should I do this or not? And then it moves through to the blue, where the decision is more like, how do I do this? How do I get the beer bottle from there to my mouth, right? And as you engage in an activity over and over again, this decision-making process gets biased more and more towards the blue and away from the red. And this especially happens with addictive use. Early on with substance use, as they're spiraling through and making all these decisions, most of the processing and decision making is in these red areas where it's, should I do this or not? That's where most of the thinking happens. Later on, once the addiction has taken hold, it zips right through that decision-making process, and most of it is in this blue area of, how do I use this? And it becomes automatic. So it becomes kind of automatic over time. And we've all kind of experienced this, because anything you do repeatedly will have that. So like, for example, one day I got in my car, right? I got in my car and I, put my seatbelt on, drove off, drove down the road, this lane, that lane, pulled into the parking spot, got out of my car, and then at work, and then I realized, wait a minute, it's Sunday and I was going to get donuts. Why am I at work? It's because I did this same process when I got into my car, and I zipped through the decision of where I'm going to go. And most of the processing was, how am I going to get there? It was just kind of an automatic thing. I just did the same thing that I always do. You get the same sorts of stories from people when I ask them about relapse. Oh, I was driving down the road and I saw a liquor sign, and the next thing I knew, I was drunk. They're not lying. That's a real thing. What happened was, they saw this cue, they zipped right past all of this, should I drink or not, and then by the time they realized what they were doing, the beer's halfway down their throat, because it's so automatic. This is why it's crucial that you identify triggers and avoid those as much as possible, because in later stages of addiction, you'll already have made this automatic decision to use. And it's very much more difficult to stop that process once it's in this blue region than it is before you've even triggered it. Okay.
We have a question, Dr. Myrtle.
Yeah.
Can you explain the relationship of stress again? I didn't quite understand why stress is such a big trigger. Is it because the actions are so strongly paired, meaning more dopamine during using and stress?
Well, it's because the stress itself will increase the dopamine further. It just interacts with the dopamine system. So whatever dopamine release you are going to get, say you encounter that beer bottle. You see the beer bottle, you're going to get that cue is going to take you through this process, and that itself is going to trigger a dopamine release and trigger cravings. If you're under stress, that dopamine release is just going to be even higher. The stress itself sensitizes that whole process. So it's just a subconscious thing that the two are intertwined. The desire to use and the dopamine system and the stress system are intertwined in such that they reinforce each other. So the less stress you're under, the more you're going to be able to control those. It's really, you'll have less urges and they'll be easier to control. Okay, so I'll give you some takeaways. We'll have a little time for questions too, if there's any remaining ones. But so the main things to take away, if you weren't paying attention at all, just give me 30 seconds. So I'll give you the main thing. So addictive drugs directly increase the desire for drug use, regardless of the consequences. This is just a neurobiological property of addictive substances. They make you want to use more. Managing stress, for the reason I just said, is critical for preventing relapse. It will reduce that desire. You can engage in meaningful, fulfilling activities. That is going to weaken, literally weaken the hold of addictive drugs. It weakens the synapses. And normal self-control systems are compromised by drug use, but through therapy and other techniques, you can strengthen those self-control systems and help people control their substances. None of this is a cure. It's not totally reversible, but it is something that can be treated, and especially if you engage in active recovery over time, you can gain more control over the substance use. All right, so that was my last slide. So if there's any remaining questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Morrow. Is there any other questions? Can you touch on diagnosed and undiagnosed mental health disorders and substance use?
Yes, substance use very commonly occurs along with another psychiatric disorder. I think it's over half of people with substance use disorders have some other psychiatric disorder. And in my practice, it's almost everybody has some other kind of psychiatric disorder. So it's very important to screen for that, because you can't treat it if you're not recognizing it. And treating it along with the substance use disorder is really going to improve outcomes for people, because you have to deal with that stress. And there's just a number of studies that show concurrent treatment at the same time of both the addiction and the psychiatric use disorder is critical for these folks actually recovering. So, yeah.
There's a comment in the chat. So someone's saying they quit cold turkey is less likely to remain sober, or they may substitute one addiction for another. For example, cocaine for alcohol, alcohol for food, etc.
Yeah, that's a common thing. I mean, they all have the same basic neurobiology. So the things that make you use cocaine, that will reduce your prefrontal cortex, influence over your subcortex. It's going to put your nucleus accumbens into hyperdrive. That's going to translate into higher addiction risk for all kinds of other things. And so it's easy for people sometimes to just move from one to the other to the other. And the same people who are at risk for cocaine are generally speaking at risk for other substance use as well. So that's definitely a common thing to occur. So it's important to that's one of the reasons it's important to identify meaningful, healthy activities that can substitute for the substance use, as opposed to something that's also self-destructive. That's ultimately not going to be helpful. Sometimes I have people just want to eat a tub of ice cream or something. Well, let's find something else. Maybe that's better than cocaine, but let's find something that's actually good for you that you can engage in. That's going to be meaningful for you. Yeah.
There's also a question, I believe it's a question, self-medicating the mental health symptomology.
Yeah, self-medicating, it's a common way to get into substance use. So I think that's part of the reason that other psychiatric disorders put people at higher risk for substance use. But I will say that if people, I think that's how it starts, and it can expose people to a lot of substances. But if they have an addiction, that's not really why they're doing it anymore. To the extent that they have an addiction, that's not really why they're doing it. If they're really using every time in order to treat their psychiatric symptoms, that may be misuse, that may be high risk use, but it's not an addictive use. That's a conscious goal that they're trying to meet. If that's the case, treat their underlying disorder and they'll stop using and they won't, there's no reason for them to ever relapse. They don't have an addiction in that case. But I think an addiction often develops because of the substance use. Yeah.
Okay, and we have a couple more minutes. What resources do you recommend for educating ourselves and clients about the neurobiology of addiction? And also, do you know of any resources that explore why some people are more susceptible to addiction than others?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on that. I could give a whole series on that because that's my area of research. So I know some of that. I should have thought of there's not really great textbooks that I know of for neurobiology of addiction, but the PCSS, what is it called? The providers, I'm forgetting the acronym, but
Provider Clinical Support System.
Yeah. So they have good webinars in there about neurobiology of addiction. The NIDA website, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has a good resources there on neurobiology of addiction. And they'll point you to other references as well in those that you can look if you want to look into the primary sources as well. So there's a lot of resources like that.
Hey, Melissa, we have a couple more a little bit further up the chat. One of them, it says, I've heard before it takes 2 years of sobriety to heal many parts of the brain from drug use. Is this still accurate?
I don't know that I would give a number like that. It's certainly you get improvement over time if you're engaging in these kind of healthy activities. Certainly therapy can help with that. But I will say that as far as we know, the neurobiological changes that come with addiction are essentially permanent. The brain is not going to go back to the pre-addicted state ever, really. And so it's important that people recognize addiction is a chronic illness, and so it needs treatment chronically. We don't have a cure for it; we have treatments for it, and that's why it's important for people to engage in active recovery long term. I really don't like when people say I used to be an addict or something like that. That just makes no sense neurobiologically. You can get control over it. It's like diabetes or something. You can get control over it. But it's not going to go away.
Okay, there is one more question. What about medication and mental health disorder, such as Ritalin and ADHD?
The Cliff Notes is that those reduce impulsivity. If you have ADHD, that will reduce your risk for relapse if you have ADHD. If you don't have ADHD, it will increase impulsivity. It will increase your risk for addiction. So it really makes a difference whether you actually have that diagnosis or not.
Okay, and they're specifically asking, are these kind of gateway drugs to use other substances?
Not if you have ADHD. They're protective if you have ADHD.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Remember, you will get an email that has the information how to receive credits after we close the presentation. I will stay on for a few minutes, just taking care of things. So if anybody has any questions for me or for the MOC, go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can ask me. But have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Morrow.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.